Going on, guys? It's Jared. I'm coming here today to kind of give you some assembly instructions for the Galileo extruders. And by extruders, I mean both the 2.1/2.2 extruder and the version 2.4 afterburner Galileo clockwork. So what you see in front of you here is more or less everything you'd need to get the entire system installed. It does not have the stepper in here just because I'm kind of short on space, but I do have the stepper here, and I can show you how all that goes together. So the first thing that we're going to mention here is if you're not part of the group buy, this may sound a little bit weird to you as far as the explanation here goes, but the group buy comes with MJF parts. And MJF is an HP technology. It uses a fine PA12 nylon powder, and it basically inkjet prints individual layers with a binding agent that holds the pieces together. So the cool part about it is you actually get the same amount of structural strength in the Z-axis as you do in the XY axis, which is something that FDM printers do not do. But the downside is, because it's printed in so much powder, there is almost always going to be some residual powder left on any nooks and crannies. And because we have some fairly tight nooks and crannies in both the planetary gears and the ring gear housing, we are going to need to clean that out just a little bit to make sure that all that powder is gone. Otherwise, you'll have some motion that's not smooth, and you can potentially have some grinding just of those little particles getting into there and then rubbing back and forth and back and forth. So the first thing we're going to do here is I'm actually going to slide some of these parts up out of the way a little bit. And tell you what, let's start with the planetary gears themselves. So on the planetary gears, we've got pretty good definition on all the individual teeth here. Come on. There you go. So we do have pretty good definition on all the teeth, but there's still going to be a little bit of powder left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a wire brush, and this will actually be a leftover that you have if you built one of the version 2 printers in the past. These are on the BOM for nozzle scrubbers, for cleaning off the print nozzle before a print for any ooze. So the packs that were normally linked before had some brass and some, what I'm assuming is some sort of steel, but I've not tested, brushes on there. So I'm just going to take one of these spare brushes, and believe me when I say it's not going to harm anything on this, and I'm going to take it and I'm just going to scrub. Sorry for these shadows, I don't know how well you can see anything with that, but I'm just going to go through and kind of scrub out each little set of, 3 or 4 spurs that are on the gear. And what that's going to do is it's going to clean out any of that excess powder that didn't come out from the machining process or the printing process, and that's going to give us a good mesh point. So with even just a few seconds, see if you can get that to focus on there. I know I have a little bit of a shadow from that light, which makes it a little bit hard, but come on, can you try to focus up there? So just that little bit has actually cleaned up quite a bit of it. And beside the hair that's on my desk, let's see if I can kind of scoop this into a little bit of a pile just to show you what all comes out. So it did actually all get caught on the edge of my hand here. So you can see all that black powder is powdered nylon. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to flip the gear over, make sure that I got the other side as well, because it is important that the very edges are nice and clean. And once I'm done with that, I'm actually going to switch gears a little bit and use, these are just a pair of fiber shears actually, and they've got one smooth side, one serrated side. I'm going to go to the smooth side, and just to make sure that the inside of this is nice, I'm going to go ahead and take the blade, and again, it's going to be hard for me to get an image of this, but I'm basically taking the blade of the scissor and I'm running it along the outside perimeter just to get any additional powder that may have been caught inside the hole out. And that's going to keep the tolerances on our bearing nice and tight without stretching out the gear, which would cause the entire system to bind. So you'll notice I'm not using like any liquids or any solvents or anything when I do this. It's not required. So you can see that was just pulled out of the inside of the gear. So we're going to quickly go through and do that with the other two real quick. And then once we have all three of these ready, we'll move on to the next point. So from there, you now have three nice clean MJF gears. Let me run back across the bottom of this guy just to make sure that that corner is good. See a little extra dust in there still. So all three of those are looking pretty good now. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm actually going to pull down the bearings for these. And these are MR95 bearings. So they are 9mm outer, 5mm inner. And they should just slide down in place. So you actually don't need a whole lot of friction on the bearing themselves when pushing them into place, because they don't need to be captive on the bearings, basically. They just need to sit in there with a fairly tight tolerance, and these don't really wiggle, but they don't need to be press fit in. So we're also not deforming our MJF parts, which is what we want. So you can see all three of those fell in there quite nicely. Now the carrier, which does have a flat for the Bondtech gears built into it. The backside of the carrier here has 5mm shafts on it, and they should be just tall enough to make it through the bearing. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one of the 27 tooth planetary gears with the bearing side facing up, and we're going to push it down on top of the carrier so that the bearing is basically seating on this flat surface on the carrier. Otherwise we'd be doing MJF to MJF and it just wouldn't spin. So one thing I will say about the MJF parts on these is sometimes the carriers are a little bit tight on the ends. So the end dimensions of these little the little prongs that stick out may be a little bit larger than they're supposed to be. That part you can just kind of force over. It's not going to hurt anything. So we're 2 for 2, nice and smooth there. Well, there goes a gear off of one of the bearings, but let's get that picked back up real quick. And away we go. So now we have three very smoothly spinning planetary gears. So the next step is to set that to the side. We'll just set it over there. See if I can kind of reorganize everything to get it all centered again here. And we're going to take the ring gear house and we're going to do the same thing with the brush. So it's got a lot of teeth in here that are very fine. It's a little harder to get inside of these teeth because you can't go the direction of the teeth. You got to go perpendicular. So what I like to do is kind of try to get the brush in a little bit sideways if I can without messing up the brushes too much. So you'll see the top two on this one I've already got kind of flared out a little. That's because instead of going sideways, and I just bumped the camera there, sorry guys. Instead of going sideways, what I'll do is actually go face down. So I'm going to get in here and I'm going to rub back and forth, and I'm going to make sure that I get down in those corners again, because those corners like to be where everything sticks. So not only do we have the actual the gear lines that like to hold material, but we've also got the bottom corner that likes to hold material. And you'll see I'm just going back and forth 5 or 6 times per. And for the most part, that should be enough. Since these gears are not as pointed or as sharp as the planetary gears, it doesn't tend to hold as much down in them. But you will see that there's still a fair amount in there. So it's something you want to do. Again, this just makes everything kind of go together a little more smoothly. And if you've got everything nice and smooth, tell you what, let me flip it this way so the lights come in the other direction. You might be able to see this a little better. The easiest way I've found to get these lined up is to kind of take the bottom of two gears and kind of think of it if it was sitting on a flat piece of, whatever, table, whatever you've got. And I just kind of set those across so that the two mesh in there. And then you kind of just press the top in a little bit until it drops into the gear that it wants to mesh with. And then you just push it the rest of the way down. So, just to give you one more demonstration of that. We've got two, we set flat just barely on the edge, rock the third into place. With everything in place, press it all down on the top, and then everything is locked down. So you will notice that with this how it stands, you might be able to hear a little bit of grinding if I push all the way down. That's because the gears are touching. Fortunately for us, the gears always will try to be pushing away from them just because of the friction that's on it. Since we're open on the top, it's always going to have a little less friction, which is going to keep the planetary carrier forward. But also with that said, we still want to add lubrication to this, because if we don't, we're going to end up chewing some things up, and that's going to cause us issues down the road. So what I suggest for this is just a plain white lithium grease. You'll notice I just brought something in that is not plain white lithium grease. I actually have some calcium sulfonate grease, which is some pretty high quality stuff, but you definitely don't need it for this application. So if you just use some plain white lithium grease, make sure it does not have graphite in it. So it does need to be white, not gray. If it has graphite, graphite is an abrasive. And while it may help you in the short term get this thing running smoothly, which we'll get to in just a minute, it's not going to help you long term. So what I like to do is take a little grease. I just put it in a syringe. It makes it easier to dispense. And I'll actually go through this kind of Y that's right here, or a boomerang, or whatever you want to call it, and squirt a little bit of grease in. So I've got that channel pretty well filled up, and then if you look from the top, there's nothing showing at the top yet. But what I'll do is I'll go ahead and take and rotate that a couple times, just back and forth with my fingers. And once most of what's in there kind of seems to disappear, which you'll see a lot of it comes back out the top here, I'll go ahead and do a little more just right in the middle and repeat the process. So you don't need a ton of grease for this, but you do want enough to keep the gears and everything lubricated. So once you get to a certain point, it gets fairly easy to kind of tell. But so long as you have kind of a little sheen of grease across everything, you should be okay. And if you go around a few times on the front, you will find that all the gears on the front also get a nice sheen on them. So I'm just going to try to push some of this grease back down in there with my thumb. And then what I'll do, now that we have the carrier and everything together, normally you just, throw a stepper on the back of it and call it a day, right? Well, that will work, but you'd be missing an opportunity. So this does run pretty nice and smooth as it is, which is exactly how you want it to be. But if there's just a little bit of hitch in one little spot or two, which this one might have just a little bit of tightness in one or two spots, what you can do, and what I have done, is take a drill. So this is a little Milwaukee M12 multi-tool I've got, and chuck up the MJF carrier in the front just like that. And then what I'll do, and you probably want to take a rag or a paper towel or something, is just cover around this and then run it on low for about 10 or 15 seconds. And I'll kind of vary the RPM. I don't want to go super fast with it, just because you can introduce a lot of friction and heat. But I do want to give it enough rotations to kind of help everything mesh a little. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. All right, so you'll see I got a little grease out of the bottom, and hey, that's actually a pretty good view. Some of the excess grease has kind of been thrown out, and then back on the top side, once I take this back out of here, you'll see that it doesn't look a whole lot different as far as the grease goes, but everything has been thrown around towards the outer edges, and everything's in there quite nicely. So that will help with any like real snags that are in there, but you will still have some rubbing on the bottom of this carrier until you get everything together. So if it's not perfectly smooth, don't worry too much about it, but if you can't rotate it easily with your fingers, then it's going to be a problem. So and if you do take the carrier out of the ring gear housing, you will see that we do have good coverage on all the gears. Maybe you can see that. We do have good coverage on all the gears and of the entire housing. And nylon is very resistant to most chemicals and greases and such, so you won't have any issues with adding grease to this, just in case anybody was concerned about that. So you don't need to wipe out the extra grease. That'll just stay in there and keep everything nice and lubricated as things go on. Get this mesh together one more time. Nice and smooth. And then what we'll do is I'll kind of give you a demonstration. I do have the Galileo clockwork parts here. So for the clockwork, the way you're going to want to assemble this, and the reason I'm picking the clockwork is because it's more difficult to assemble, but it's still not hard. So the way that this guy works is these pieces mesh together like so, and then this would be the front, this would be the back, and what you'll do is you start with the back half, and you'll see I already have some heat sets in here. There's 2 on the front of there, and there's 2 on the back. So there's 4 total in the rear half. For the front half, you've got 2 on the front. Losing some of my background light. There we go. 2 on the front, 1 on the side where the cable manager goes, the cable cover, a 6mm one in this portion of the body, and then you've got another one for the door over here. So the way this guy gets assembled is we're going to take our carrier assembly here, and we are just going to drop it in place. You'll notice there's 2 grooves around the outer edge here. Those match up with the 2 grooves around the outer edge here. So whenever you drop it in place, it should positively locate. Whenever you press down, it doesn't go anywhere. So from there, next step would be to install the stepper. So to install the stepper, it can be a little bit tricky, just because even if you try to rotate this, all the planetary gears are going to try to keep it in the same spot. So what you actually have to do is kind of pull down while this is still positively rotated. So it sits in its little grooves. You kind of have to rotate that around potentially to get it to do that. I've always had good luck with just kind of wiggling it into place. So try to get the teeth to line up, and then just kind of wiggle it until it snaps in just like that. So I've had better luck doing it that way, but I have had luck doing it both ways. So once you get it together, it's going to be real hard to turn because you are turning the stepper motor 7.5 times for every single rotation of this guy. So what we'll do for now is, these are normally socket head cap screws. I've got some button heads just because it's what I've got left over at the moment. So what you'll do is you'll take your screws, maybe, if they want to cooperate. There we go. So you'll take your screws, drop them into the holes. I'm using an ES120 electric screwdriver here, which is wonderful, especially for people that have, carpal tunnel and arthritis like I do. But it is very difficult to spin because you are spinning 7.5 times per minute. So those will rotate awfully quick. But you will notice that there is some forward and backward play here. That's normal and by design. So what I actually normally do is I'll pull it all the way up before I attach everything down so that it makes it all the way through where it's supposed to be. So next step is the 148 ZZ bearings. And you'll notice there's a little recess that's in here right around the shaft. That is for a specific purpose. And that specific purpose is because otherwise this would be too thick. So same thing with the carrier. So like I say, sometimes the end of the shaft can be a little bit tighter because it's a little bit oversized. That does seem to be the case on this one, but once you get it past that first little point, it tends to go in pretty easy. So, and you might be able to see some shiny parts where that bearing kind of rubbed over. So after you get that in place, what you'll have is your 8mm Bondtech here. And let me actually take the grub screw out of this guy just so we're not fighting with that. And we will put this guy over, and since this guy is pretty tight tolerance as well, it's going to take a little bit of extra work to get that in there. And the easiest way I found of this is to take something like a little pair of needle nose, just kind of hold that in place and slide it down. It doesn't take any force to do it, but that will keep the carrier shaft at the front where it needs to be. So once you do that, you're just going to tighten down the grub screw on the Bondtech gear. You're going to take the other bearing, those are the 148s, take the other bearing and put it in place. All right, so the easiest way to do this, there are little tabs that kind of keep things keyed together. Small one on top, big one on the bottom. Just kind of line it all up. And since the Bondtech gear is positively attached to the carrier and the carrier is pulled forward, you can just press fit this right into place. And you'll see that that flushes up nicely. And depending on how well you can see with the light that's in there, that filament path lines up just perfectly with the holes that are in there. So everything lines up nice that way. And then what you'll do is you'll take the rest of your screws and everything you've got and put it all together. So, all right. Got the 148 bearing off, got the Bondtechs off, and have the rear 148 off. So now that I have grease on everything again, back to plain carrier. Same process for the 2.1. So we're going to take these guys and set them back into place so it rotates nice and smoothly. And then what we're going to do is, instead of putting it through the back plate, as we are just going to take our 148, press it straight on the front, put our bearing, sorry, not bearing, but Bondtech gearing right over that, and then put the 148 back on the front of that guy. And then what you'll do is put this whole assembly straight into this guy. Well, tell you what, let me open that to make that a little easier. So let me get that screw out of my way. Let me get these two back where they belong. And for the ring gear housing, there we go. So that's now locked in place. And then what you do for the 2.1 and 2.2 tool head is you'd run a couple screws through these guys. I'm just going to give you one for now as a demonstration. And same thing with the stepper motor. Easiest I found is just to kind of wiggle it into place, and then once it's in place, screw it down. And there you go. So if you're doing the 2.1 and 2.2 tool head models, this is what you'll end up with. If you're doing the afterburner one, the afterburner one's what you'll end up with. So I have switched over to the afterburner setup at this point. I do not have any downsides to it. It is about 40 grams heavier on the whole, including the carriage weight and all the rest of it, than the 2.1 and 2.2 tool head setup is. but overall, for the slimness of the design and some of the other features it offers, I prefer it. So that's going to be it, guys. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Easiest way to get a hold of me is going to be on Discord, but if you do send a YouTube message or add a comment here, I will most likely get it. So the most important thing, again, is just making sure that the carrier and the planetary gears are all cleaned up properly before you put everything together, and make sure you're using grease when you do put it together, just to make sure that everything stays together for a long period of time. So if there's anything else you guys need, let me know. Talk to you later.